Perhaps I can begin just by contextualising things a little bit. The other day, we saw the regional cooperation minister in Israel threaten Palestinian people with a second Nakba if the current clashes in Jerusalem intensified and continued. He was very explicit on that point. A second Nakba or another Nakba was threatened. And we have seen, indeed, among others, the most recent casualty is 16-year-old Abdurrahman Hussein Abu Hamisha, killed just the other day as a result of these clashes. Other people killed, of course, tragically as a result of the recent intensification of violence. 225 people injured, according to official Palestinian figures. And so my question to the panel is, what are the prospects for the BDS campaign and for Palestinian solidarity generally in this context and in the political context of the world at the moment? What are the challenges and what are the grounds of optimism?
Well, BDS is very important in the role that it plays outside of Palestine. So within the international global movement, boycotts, divestments, and sanctions is the only game in town, as has been said many times before. So it's important to note that for us out here, this is the way to go. This is what needs to be done, and there is urgency. I mean, you've mentioned just a few things that happened over the last 2 days, but the bigger story is the one that never gets told. It's the daily suffering of living under siege, under occupation, missing out on opportunities to go to school, missing out on opportunities to get proper medicine, really missing out on a life, having your life stolen from you from the moment that you are born. So there is urgency for the international community to act in terms of governments, and the governments are not going to act until we make them do so. So the onus in the international realm is on us to adopt boycotts, divestments, and sanctions, to raise awareness, and to really understand that there is urgency in us doing so. As for the prospects within Palestine, they have to choose their own kind of resistance, and BDS was never meant to be a call for Palestinians to adopt inside Palestine. It's a call outward. And we see different forms of resistance in different parts of Palestine. And it really is something that they have to do. But I strongly believe, and I know I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but I strongly believe that the biggest obstacle that faces the Palestinian people on the inside right now is the lack of leadership on the inside, and the lack of representation, and the fact that the Palestinian factions are literally fighting to the death of their people at the moment. And we see the result of this in Gaza.
You know, I largely agree with what Samah has outlined, and I think because of that problem, because of that lack of representation, it makes BDS tactics even more important. Precisely because of what the call is about and what it demands, and the three central demands of the BDS call, which, when you look at Palestinian public opinion, are the central components that bind together all different elements of Palestinian society. So in the absence of legitimate representation, and I think we can agree that there are huge problems when it comes to representation and leadership among Palestinians. In the absence of that, BDS has offered a platform in these demands that is very much representative of what Palestinians want to see: an end to the occupation, the right of return for refugees, and equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel. And unfortunately, throughout the course of the peace process period, what we have seen as a result of that is, little by little, segments of the Palestinian community, be they the diaspora, refugees, Palestinian citizens of Israel, have had their interests ignored by the parties that represent Palestinians at the negotiating table. So I think because of those demands that BDS puts forward, it offers us at this moment a unique way of supporting all Palestinians at a crucial moment when there isn't a representative leadership to do just that.
If I could add something to that, To reinforce what both have just said, particularly Samah's point, the danger in the BDS campaign is that the demands, which are very important, are slightly abstract and remote from what Samah mentioned about the daily suffering of the Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank. And the daily horrors there, for example, the Defence of Children International reports something like 8,000 innocent civilians have been killed, including close to 2,000 children. Now, it's important, I think, when we're pushing the BDS program to understand that it's not just these abstract questions of statehood and the return and the end of the occupation. The end of the occupation is because of what the occupation is doing in terms of the vast numbers of crimes. And I worry that we lose sight of the daily horrors when we talk at these more abstract levels. So I think that part of the BDS campaign has to be to keep reinforcing what the media don't give enough attention to.
Just briefly, this year we've had two horrific anniversaries, the 50th anniversary of the occupation and the 10th year of the blockade of Gaza. And the narrative around those things has often been about the grey permanence of the situation, and lots of people using language like a slow-moving catastrophe, and that Palestine only hits the front page when there's a particular outbreak of a particular sort of violence that hits the front page, whether it's a bombardment of Gaza or some Palestinians. So I think what the hope is a possibility that we can be proactive. And lots of us have been involved in East Timor, and I started early years saying, what's going to be our Santa Cruz moment? And in East Timor, it was when the Indonesian military opened fire on a whole lot of people at a funeral in a cemetery, and that was when the world woke up and it sparked it. But we don't want a Santa Cruz moment. We don't want to have another decimation in Gaza or another 50 years of occupation for it to, the suffering to go. And I think the hope of the BDS campaign is we get proactive. We don't wait till Israel's violence puts Palestine on the front page. We get active and get moving in a really proactive way.
Well, I wonder whether we can talk about how we do that in relation particularly to the political class in the West, because we've just been speaking about the lack of leadership in Palestine. That's not the only place where there's a flagrant lack of leadership, and I was struck by a recent essay that just came out this year by A.L. Weissman and Karen Estefan, who say that they say, because of the alignment of the entire political class against BDS, BDS can become a revolutionary force against Western leaders. Now, that might seem a bit exaggerated, but it's still true, isn't it, that Zionism is something that really closely links together the left and right establishments in the West. It's certainly true of a place like Australia. So what can we do in the interests of becoming proactive politically to link the Palestinian cause with the growing, disaffection that exists in Western publics with what we could call a politics of the extreme centre? So perhaps you have some thoughts on that. What can we do now to harness disaffection with Western leaders in the cause of Palestine and BDS? Yousef?
I think there's something to that. I think it's a little bit exaggerated. But I think, particularly in the United States, one of the things that we have seen is that BDS is actually not unpopular. BDS is becoming very, very popular, particularly on the left and also among some mainstream liberals, even if they're not using it to advance Palestinian rights. They're using the tactics increasingly on a variety of other social justice issues, whether it's boycotting corporations that have decided to invest in North Carolina after they've passed some egregious laws against the LGBTQ community, or whether it's for prison divestment, or whether it's for any other range of issues. There was recently a very successful campaign to get Bill O'Reilly, who was a TV personality, I don't know how well he's known here, but on our Murdoch media in the United States, on Fox News, the single most watched primetime cable network because of his history of misogyny and so on, and he ended up getting fired. That was a celebrated campaign among mainstream liberals. So it's not the tactics that are the issue, it's the cause. And I think it's important for us to remind people as much as possible that this is not a movement about tactics. This is a movement about people's rights which has embraced these tactics. And these tactics are being used and are being welcomed on a variety of other issues. And we have to confront people and say, why not on this issue as well?
Totally agree. And I will just add from observations of some of the discussion that we've had today and yesterday, we really need to understand and differentiate between tactics, the cause, and the campaigns. And if we have criticism, if this criticism is of the campaign or of the principle of BDS or of the tactics, because people run around and say, we are critical of the BDS. And most of the time, they're critical of one particular BDS campaign or one particular target. And so I think this is really very important to understand the difference and to differentiate between the differences when we are speaking of BDS.
This reminds me of one of the first things that were said in the opening of this conference was in the statement by the parliamentarian whose name escapes me now. I want to say Park was her name. One of the things she said towards the end is, maybe you shouldn't call it BDS or something like that. And one of the things that always irks me, because it plays into the hands of our opponents, is that we too often speak of the BDS movement. And while there is a movement that is using BDS tactics, it is not a BDS movement. It is a movement for Palestinian rights. And when we talk about movements that have been successful and that are well known throughout history, we don't refer to them by the tactics that they use, but the cause which they are for. And so there has been a really pernicious campaign in the United States and around the world to try to turn the acronym of BDS, which many people, by the way, if you ask them what does BDS stand for, they don't know what BDS stands for, right? But to turn that acronym into something akin to, the acronym for some terrorist organization. That's what the effort is, to scare people to associating these letters with something that they should be afraid of, with something that is extreme, when the reality is they're tactics that are the exact opposite of that people actually embrace in the mainstream.
I could just add to that. I think that's exactly right. And of course, a big part of the adversarial attack on BDS is the anti-Semitic charge. And Yousef's point is very important, because the moment you start talking about the Palestinian cause and the rights and justice and international law, that diffuses completely the concern about the alleged anti-Semitic basis, which doesn't have any evidence anyway, but I think Yousef's point is very important to diffuse what is a very, very systematic and highly funded campaign to try to demonize it as anti-Jewish. So I think that's very important for us to remember.
Yeah, APAN's been doing political work, if you like, for most of its time, and which is 6 years, not a long time of its history. And I've been astounded already at the shift that's happened within Australian politics in terms of how palatable not BDS is, but how palatable talking about Palestinian human rights is in the Australian Parliament. We had 1/5 of the Parliament last year signed a statement about no way to treat a child around children in military detention. So I think in terms of our political classes, we together have made Palestine more palatable. But BDS as a tactic, as one of the tactics we use as a movement, I'm really grateful for you reframing it. I'm guilty all the time about talking about the BDS movement. In fact, isn't that their website? But anyway, this is not a political tactic. The BDS is a people power tactic. It's what actually comes before political change, that we are the people movement. We are the way that demonstrates the force behind the desire for Palestinian human rights. It actually opens up the political space. And I expect the last people to sign up to BDS are people who deal in politics, because necessarily politics is about, gaining power, and they're not going to be that interested in that when there's so much of a risk. So I don't think BDS is something that we're looking for the political classes to sign up to. One of APAN's big focuses is to preemptively think about any legal action against BDS, and have already been talking to lots of parliamentary allies about ensuring they'll be there to respond if the attack comes. But I'm not expecting, I'd almost hope politicians often don't talk about BDS, because that's where the shitstorm happens. Like, let's just Let's bring it up and let's bring the people power movement, and that will create political space for the end game. And the end game isn't BDS, the end game is freedom and justice for Palestinians.
Well, I wonder in that case what your thoughts are on how, as a campaign, we can identify intermediate goals, because I think that's something that we're generally bad at doing. How do we measure how we're going? And short of the complete liberation of Palestine and the end of the occupation, what are the heuristics or the measures that we should use to work out and to evaluate whether we're, doing a good job or not?
I was having a conversation with somebody earlier who was reflecting about the only other time we've had an event like this before, which was 7 years ago in Melbourne. And people were saying we were just in a really different position. We were only just starting to get to know the acronym ourselves about BDS. We were just starting to get our heads around stuff. For me, the excitement of this conference has been the maturity that we've gained in the last 7 years. We're able to think self-critically and dare to criticise one another or talk about what lessons we've learnt from our own campaigning. We're able to think about questions of intersectionality and what that means both in terms of supporting other people's struggles, but also thinking about our movement and how gender and class and culture are playing out in our movement to make sure we're not replicating oppressions. And so I feel like that's a great foundation, that we're able to talk amongst all our political differences. And I feel like there's been a generosity in the last couple of days, even amidst the differences that, frankly, I often find missing in the Palestine movement. So I've been really excited about that. So that's the bit that I've been able to think about. I think we've started by building a foundation. I think we should be excited about that.
If I could just address what I think is the point of your question, Nick, really going back to what I said before, I think talking about BDS to the general public doesn't make a lot of sense in the ways that perhaps Yousef was saying. But if we talk about the ongoing, on the ground, as we say, tragedies and horrors there, people feel that they need to do something, and then the natural place to go is to support a campaign like BDS, because you often hear people say, what can we do? What's the possibility for ordinary people to contribute? And we're the answer to that. So I think that not just talking about BDS and its goals, but talking about the problems in Palestine that can touch people's hearts. And I think that's the way to get further support.
Thanks, Peter. So I suppose what I was trying to get at, which I perhaps didn't express adequately, is what are the intermediate staging goals for the movement that will allow us to track how well we're working together?
I agree with Peter. There is space to do that, but I think there's also space to campaign. And so you can do both. You can take whichever path that makes more sense to you. But it is really important that we also use the campaign as a place to start raising awareness. Where do we start? I think we start by reflecting on past campaigns that we've run here. Be critical of ourselves. And I saw this happening over the last 2 days. We've had plenty of time to reflect, to be critical, to engage with one another, to have conversations about past campaigns. And when you're picking the next campaign, if it's going to be a national one, choose targets that make sense, that relate directly to Israeli crimes. And I think I really want to hear more from Yousef on this, because he's probably he's got a lot of experience from running campaigns in the US about how you pick and choose a campaign when you're starting.
We struggle with this as well, and it's something that we think about often. But I would like to suggest that it's important for us, for those in this room, to not think about the strategy as you go about deciding targets and campaigning with the objective of liberating Palestine, as much as we would all like to see that. Our goal in this space is not about that. Our goal in this space is addressing the complicity of those we have the most influence over to support that ultimate objective. Everyone sitting in this room is part of a global movement towards that end. The question that we should be asking here is, what can we do in Australia to the greatest extent that we can to end Australian complicity in the abuse of Palestinian rights? And that same question has to be asked in its own unique context in every place around the country and around the world. In the United States, what we are asking ourselves is, what can we do to change American policy? How do we build towards that? And I think when we talk about framing our campaign strategy within that view, it requires taking into consideration the politics in the space that you're in. So there's only so much advice that I could lend here because I'm not very familiar with the dynamics. But I think in general, what I would suggest is campaigns that are focusing on targets should be selected on a number of different criteria, but they should include whether or not it's a winnable campaign, whether or not it will generate excitement, but also, where is it taking us? Where is it taking us, as in the people who are working on this issue in this space? Where is it taking us? Is it bringing us to a stage closer to having power and influence to ultimately change Australian government policy? And if it's not, then it's probably not a campaign that should be prioritized, right? Because, this is a global movement, but at the same time, we have limited means, limited resources, and we need to be very strategic with the way that we use that. And so there's an unending number of targets, right? But the question is, how do we choose them in a way that maximizes our power, that helps us grow, and that helps us take our influence to the next level?
So I wonder whether we can, think about how we might begin to do that on what's supposed to be our own side. Because I think when we make the case for BDS, we often find ourselves having arguments with leftists, with progressive-except-Palestine people who are prepared to, go all the way with us, except when it comes to Israel. And everybody here is a seasoned Palestine campaigner. So as much more of a newcomer to the campaign, I myself would like some tips, on what I can do or what we can do to just incrementally shift the balance so that we get more progressive-except-Palestines, seeing the importance both of the issue and of our tactics. So, Samah, could I ask you to...
I've had a lot of experience with the progressives except for Palestine, and I found that in most cases, I am just wasting my time in the engagement. I don't give up on people easily, and so I'll stay for a long time trying to work with someone over, just getting them to cross over that last threshold. And it's hard, but I was there for Ghassan Hajj's lecture this morning. Many of you were. You just got to know when you're not getting through to someone and just move on. So my advice would be continue to educate, but don't put too much of your time in there. Speak to the broader audience, and if they're part of it, that's great. Eventually, if they're going to come around, they will. But we have to focus on people who are literally dying every day. So we can't spend too much time trying to convert the ones who don't want to be converted.
Perhaps I ought to make the obvious remark there that I think I've had more experience than some are trying to talk to people who are progressive on everything except Palestine. Let me think of something quickly to say about that. Look, I don't think it is quite a waste of time. It's a statistical thing. I do make this effort to reach to the Jewish community. One of the main problems is the leadership and not the community. The community are much more willing to listen, actually, than you'd think from listening to the leadership who are trying to hold, to people in captivity. And it's statistical because not everybody is entirely resistant. I found in my own experience that actually they're willing to argue with you and talk to you, and that has some effects. And they talk over dinner and they'll realise that maybe you haven't got horns growing out of your head once they've talked to you. And so, in fact, I think that we have to persist with those people as well, because obviously that constituency, the Jewish community, are a very important part of the problem that we're facing. And I think I can see signs, especially in America, there is very significant movement, and Yousef is probably more familiar with that, but you can read from Norman Finkelstein and others that the Jewish community are very progressive in America, Democrat voters. And so that's starting to shift there, perhaps more so than here, but I think we need to work on that. And in fact, I had a conversation just during this conference with somebody from the Australian Jewish News, and I lamented the fact that there's nobody from the community here. And if they'd come here, they'd realise this is a conversation that they can engage in. It's not like a bunch of rabid, crazy Jew haters. And that's the job that we have to do to get this audience and the rational, intelligent, interesting discussions that we've had to become familiar to that audience. So it's a difficulty, but it's not impossible, and I think that's going to be a crucial part of the equation.
I think it depends on where you're located, if you're in the community or outside the community too.
Well, I'm not in the community either, actually, but, you know.
I think there are some people you may be wasting your time with, but I don't think that's most people. And I think, you know, one thing that I found to be effective is to call people out. You know, there's a limit to which these conversations can take place in private, and it's important to make that effort. But, you know, particularly among progressives and particularly among liberals who claim to hold themselves to certain values that should be, you know, afforded to every person, call them out. Have those conversations in spaces where they're forced to have to defend excluding Palestinians from the rights that are afforded to everybody else. The conversation becomes very different at that point. And, you know, maybe there are some people you're not going to convince, and that's okay. But I think what we found is that is successful, and also it's important to make a proactive effort to inject this conversation into those spaces. And it's not going to happen without us fomenting it.
Just to be clear, are we talking about liberal Zionists specifically, or
no,
progressive-except-Palestine?
I think there's a difference. I think both need to be called out.
Okay.
Yeah, I appreciated the wet fish in the face of Ghassan Haj's comments this morning about the smugness of victimhood. And I actually would like us to take far more responsibility for our own engagement in this space. I think it's very easy for us to say we got the moral high ground, truth is on our side, and therefore it'll all come out in the wash. And we're very good at bemoaning the Israel lobby. And I've begun to shift, particularly in tuning into anti-Semitic tropes, that, I mean, there's nothing particularly kind of sinister about the Israel lobby. They're just really good at what they do. And we can bemoan Hasbara and say, oh, you know, blah, 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 blah. But we know all their dot points. We can recite all their speaking points. But what are ours? Like, have we got that smart that we know our own one-liners that hook into our deep stories and values the way theirs do? Like, have we got that smart? And I actually think that it's on us. Like, it's not enough to just know that we're the good guys, Peter. Like, we've got to get smart at communicating culturally. We've had this conversation a bit, you can tell.
Look, I don't agree with you. And I don't agree with you. I don't know what word is appropriate. You said that the lobby are not sinister. They are. I'm sorry to say it. And they play dirty, and they lie, and Yousef was right. You call them out on it, and I think we shouldn't be shy about that because they rely on us avoiding and our sensitivity, and they exploit the fact that there's still an obvious and justified sensitivity about anti-Semitism. It is sinister because they exploit that for all it's worth. And I don't think we, and especially non-Jews, they shouldn't retreat when they're threatened with that. It's bullshit, and it's a trick that they use because there's no answer to it. If you call somebody an anti-Semite, what can you say to defend yourself? There's no answer to that. And so I don't think we should tolerate this or have any sympathy for the ways in which the lobby behave. I've had my piece about that when I gave my talk.
Yes, sinister, for sure, because as somebody who's been targeted by pro-Israel groups here in Australia, they made straight-out lies in the media about my work. And you say we called them out on it. I called them out on it. But the rhetoric is still out there. The articles are still out there. There's a few of us here who have all been subjected to the same thing. So I don't think they're just good at what they're doing. I think they are sinister.
Let me just add one more thing on this. To repeat the point I made before, it's the leadership and some of the leading community organisations. The community wouldn't tolerate it if they saw it clearly. The defamation, for example, the lies. They've had to retreat on it. In my talk, I mentioned a case where the leading Jewish group here uttered the most appalling defamations of the APAN committee. They had to retreat under legal threat, but they do it repeatedly. So, I mean, but the community, if they saw it clearly, I don't think they would tolerate it. So I think we have to understand that they are sinister, and we need to not submit to their tactics.
But we need, but just to add to that, Peter, yes, while these particular organizations were saying all these lies about my work to the media, I was receiving emails from people who some of them I didn't even know, from the Jewish community, who were distancing themselves from the actions and really saying, these guys don't represent us. So I am very aware of that as well.
I wonder whether we can talk about not the Jewish community now, but the Palestinian community, and what I wonder are the most important things for a solidarity movement to do, because BDS is a solidarity campaign. What are the most important things for us to do to show real effective solidarity with Palestinian people and their struggle here now, given what's going on in Gaza, given what's going on in Jerusalem? Samah, can I start with you?
Sure. I can speak for the Palestinian community in Melbourne. When the bombs were falling on Gaza in 2014, we tried to get in touch with our MP's office and to ask for a meeting, and the MP refused to meet with us. And I sent several emails and called the office several times, and I said, do you realize there's a lot of people from Gaza who live in this area in your riding, and you're refusing to give us a meeting? Anyway, this went on for a while. 3 weeks later, I asked one of my cousins to just get me the names, get my uncles and aunties and cousins to sign a letter, because we all lived in the same area. So 111 signatures in under an hour, telling this MP that we will not, that we will remember him the next time we vote. And he called right away and invited us to come to his office. And we did, and he was completely, he listened, but he didn't do much. But what came out of it was support, and it was through Jessica and APAN, a community group of Casey Friends of Palestine. Some of them are here today somewhere. Was formed in that area, and that group's become quite active on the cultural scene. And Jessica and APAN, I think, can I say APAN, or is it just, has really helped them through learning the ropes of activism and how to do things here. So I think we can be there for one another. We can be patient with each other's journeys. The Palestinian communities are not active when it comes to everyday kind of activism, really, and they're not politically astute. So we teach them. We teach them what we know. We have to be patient, and we have to recognize that some of them are just too tired and too burnt out and too afraid to be politically involved.
I think it's important to keep doing just what we're doing here, having these conversations, pushing forward BDS efforts. To me, as Palestinian, it is inspiring to know that thousands of miles away, there are people sitting in a room in Australia talking about how they can address their complicity in abuses of Palestinian rights. And I think it sends an important message to Palestinians that there is solidarity with the cause, that they are not forgotten, even in the darkest moments. There are candles being lit, right? And continuing to do this work and continuing to bring more and more people into spaces like this, into conversations like this, building this movement at this time, I think is the most important thing that we can be doing to demonstrate our solidarity for Palestinians.
Something to say about solidarity with Palestinians as non-Palestinian BDS activists and pro-Palestine.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's always making sure I start with a position of solidarity politics, that this isn't, in one sense it's my struggle because, touch one, touch all, and none of us are free until everyone's free. But this is particularly a struggle in solidarity with Palestinians. And I always wonder how I need to, just check that and make sure that I'm listening. And I think particularly with the left, the white left, if you like, and Palestinians, I think we just need to keep listening to each other. We have some really different ways of operating, some really different cultural, assumptions, some really different ontological approaches, perhaps. And I think we just need to keep listening. I remember there's somebody said to me a couple of years ago, I couldn't get involved in the local Palestine advocacy because people wanted me to sign up to marriage equality as well. And I thought that was I think there's a really interesting tension there, because we are a movement that's about human rights full stop. And I think we do all need to challenge ourselves about how things like homophobia have kind of, affecting other people, and human rights are human rights full stop. But I think we need to find ways of operating that we are listening to our differences and working out how we can form movements that don't have to assume that people become white to become involved in the movement, or to defer to other things they're not comfortable with to become part of the movement. I think it's about having respectful conversations.
The main thing that occurs to me when you ask the question about solidarity with Palestinians is the general public, as in my case before, I didn't know any Palestinians. And mostly they don't, certainly the Jewish community don't. And so, and the mainstream media don't portray Palestinians sufficiently of the kind that you discover when you get involved with the Palestinian community. I think that's an important thing that we can achieve to make them more visible as human beings, I mean, it's kind of crazy in this context to talk that way, but when you know from the outside, I met a lot of people who've never met a Palestinian before. And I think that's a very important challenge, which is the way you establish the solidarity, just because you discover this obvious thing to say, that they're nice people. And it's stupid to say that here, but that's an important insight that, look, they're so demonised. I mean, I don't have to tell you guys, but it's a reality still that Palestinians are demonised in ways that is real, and that's an obstacle that we can overcome. But look, when they get a spokesman on some crisis, it's rarely somebody, Yousef or somebody, it's not somebody that the public can identify with and have sympathy for. That's a really important problem.
Perhaps I can put the question to each of you. What is the most important thing that has come out of the conference for you? Or alternatively, if you don't want to talk about that, what is the most important thing that you want to say now to this gathering of people from the Asia Pacific who are committed in one way or another to BDS and to the Palestinian cause? What is the take-home message that you think needs to be transmitted? So who'd like to begin on that?
Well, we need to remember that this is an urgent situation in Palestine, and that the fact that we all are here today and we were here yesterday, and Yousef is right, just looking at all of you in this room fills me up with hope, and I'm sure Palestinians who are watching this on real time on Facebook would agree. We need you to act, and we don't need you to, and I said that before, and Yousef said that, we're not asking you to get involved, we are asking you to stop the complicity that we are all tied in with Israeli crimes. So I would just say, go get them, find joy in the resistance, and find common grounds and work together.
There were so many important things that were discussed over the past 2 days, and I think the thing that I take away from this as the most important is the fact that this conference happened. And I don't think that's something that can be dismissed or overstated. This is obviously a very important institution in this country. It's the first time that this happens here at the university. It could have very easily been prevented, and there are certainly plenty of people who would have liked to have seen that happen, right? But it took place. And this is a benchmark in the growth of the efforts that are taking place in this country. And I think in the future, this will be looked back at in that way. And so I think this is a very important thing for us to reflect on. And certainly for all of those who spent time and effort working on this conference, those efforts will definitely be appreciated.
I was going to say exactly the same point that Yousef has just made, so let me just repeat it in my own words in a way. This conference has been a model of intellectual, activist, rational, sane conversation. The reason that's important to emphasise is because of the way it was demonised even before it happened, and in a way it's a pity, or maybe those people who have that attitude to it will get to see what in fact happened. And I think that's a very important way in which the significance of this has an impact beyond those of us who are here today, because I was saying to Nick too that this is now an example of the way in which Palestine advocates and activists and the BDS movement conducts itself and has a conversation which is of the highest standard and of the greatest significance. And that's what's going to turn the people who are sceptical about it. So this has been very important in terms of the way it happened and the consequences afterwards.
I think my take-home message is that we have within our midst that which we need to be smart, to be strategic, to be inclusive, to deal with the criticisms of BDS. Like, we've got it amongst our midst. Like, there were 44 people, I think, presented. Like, we the people, have got it sorted. I think we just need to find the spaces and deliberately create the spaces to listen to one another, to think smart and to plan smart. I mean, the BNC have very clear guidelines about what they think makes it for a good campaign. So let's use all this depth as we plan our next steps. As easy it is to be knee-jerk here in this issue, or to think that the truth will just come out in the end. I think let's use all the smarts that's around us and build on that.
Okay, a quick response from each of you, if that's okay, before we turn to questions. Apart from the fact that the conference has happened, what is the greatest source of optimism and hope that we should all lock onto as BDS tacticians and as pro-Palestine people?
I'm going to be poetic and say that Gaza is still resilient, and people there are still living their lives every day with beauty, with love. There's weddings going on in Palestine, in the West Bank, everywhere, in Jerusalem. Life can be beautiful, and the resistance is a reflection of the beauty of life. And so we have to fight for the things that are beautiful. And so what I would say is always remember what we're fighting. Always remember what we're fighting for, and it is this beautiful image in your mind.
We're turning the tide. Like, I really think we're turning the tide. The movement's getting bigger. As I said, my day job's to advocate for Palestine, and I get emails every day from people just saying, "How do I get involved?" So I think the fact that Israel's been so obnoxious that the movement is growing by itself, and people want to get involved. So I think the opinion polls have been really exciting. The people are ready to get on board. We just need to create stuff that looks exciting as a movement to join.
Peter.
I think what's been said is essentially the point. The talk that was just given before about the Greens campaign was very significant, because for all the shit that they got, all of the statistics improved. They got a lot of support. And so that's a very significant indicator of the fact that we and BDS are winning. And, that's the hope, and I think that the message that we should keep in mind. So that's the positive side of things that you're asking about.
I agree with what everybody has said. And I think that when you look at what is happening on the ground in Palestine, there's so much inspiration to draw from, particularly what we've seen in recent days in Jerusalem. But I would also say, too, that this movement continues to grow. And it's become very clear that the Israeli state recognizes that and is starting to work against it. And I think that despite that, seeing the movement continue to grow is also a source of inspiration for me. And so, when I look at this conference, the people here, and I think about the movement in a global context, and I think about how 10 years ago, just 10 years ago, none of this was really taking place. And I think about the fact that 2 or 3 decades before the United States Congress passed a resolution to essentially sanction South Africa, the first resolution was introduced and only had 2 members of Congress signing on to it. It makes me realize that, yes, there's a long road ahead, but we are marching down it. And we are marching down it today in a way that we were not in the past. And the numbers are growing. And so I think when we reflect on where we have come from and where we are today, we can see clear where it is that we're going.
While I'm passing the microphone, can I just add to that? Paradoxically, one of the greatest signs that we're winning and we're making progress is the immense effort that Israel is making to kill it off. The amounts of money and the campaign against BDS tells us that we're on the right track and we're winning, because they wouldn't bother otherwise. And so that's the best sign.
Something that Palestinians have also taught me is that hope is also almost a spiritual principle or an ideological commitment. Working in this movement is bloody hard work. Every time our Facebook feed sees another dead child or another person arbitrarily arrested, and for many of you here, this has been your reality for decades. So I think all that stuff is true, and I want to recognise that actually sometimes it feels hard to hope, because, you know, the darkest hour is often the one before the dawn. But we had a gathering of young people in Melbourne recently, and people were talking about how they said, I'm scared to hope, but we must hope. That it is frightening to think about that possibility, but we must hope and we must choose to hope. So I think even in the dark hours where the opposition feels much stronger, I think there is an ideological decision to continue to hope.
Thanks, Jessica.